the Amazon rainforest. Hardly any archaeology has been done there, and yet we know from LiDAR surveys that there are enormous structures under that canopy. The possibility of a lost civilization and presenting the evidence for a lost civilization. But ultimately, when you talk of a lost civilization, how did it become lost? What happened that took it away, that obliterated it from human memory?
Towers made from hundreds of Aztec skulls, Neanderthal remains fused with cave rocks, and the remains of people once thought to be vampires. These are some of the most dark and disturbing ancient discoveries made by archaeologists in history. How wild does this look? This is the skeleton of a prehistoric man that's grown into the cave where he died. Gnarly. He was later dubbed the Altamura Man, but who was he? Well, the Altamura Man is actually the most complete Neanderthal fossil ever discovered. In 1993, cave explorers came across the bones in the Lamalunga cave near Altamura, Italy. They found an upside-down human skull embedded in rock, along with many other bones. The skull was covered in shiny mineral deposits known as coralloid. This gave them some indication of how old the remains were. Scientists believe the Altamura Man fell into a sinkhole and got trapped. Obviously, he never managed to escape. Over time, calcium deposits in cave formations sealed his body, turning it into a kind of natural tomb. Researchers eventually concluded that the remains were about 130,000 to 172,000 years old, making this one of the oldest Neanderthal fossils ever found. Two Dutch artists, Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, reconstructed what the Altamura Man likely looked like, which was probably something like this. Jamestown, established in 1607, was England's first permanent settlement in North America. From the start, things weren't easy. The colonists battled harsh conditions, disease, and food shortages. One of the darkest periods was the winter of 1609 to 1610. Known as the starving time. During this season, many settlers couldn't find enough food, and about 75% of them died. To survive, those who lived resorted to eating whatever they could, including each other. Now, there have been all kinds of creepy and bizarre things discovered at this site over the years, but one of the most grim was in 2012 when archaeologists came across the bones of a young girl. The bones were covered in marks that had clearly been left by blades, as if she'd been cut up and eaten like a steak. And a series of other human remains were found in a kitchen cellar mixed in with various animal bones. Most dated back to the starving time, so it was highly likely these poor folks had been eaten. Well, these folks look comfy, don't they? These are called fire mummies, human remains stored in a very specific way, a way that actually does make a lot of sense for saving space, but sounds pretty gruesome when described. The fire mummies of the Philippines, or the Kabayan mummies, are found in the mountain slopes of Kabayan in the northern Philippines, dating back as far as 2000 BCE. The mummies were created by the Ibaloy people, who would store them in caves. As for the mummification process, it would actually start while the person was still alive. Now, this wasn't a punishment kind of thing or anything like that. It would be done when someone was right on the verge of death. They'd drink a very salty beverage to prepare their body. After death, the body would be washed and positioned upright over a fire to dry out all the fluids. To further preserve the body, smoke from tobacco would be blown into the mouth to dry out the internal organs, and various herbs would be rubbed into the skin. Finally, the mummy would be crammed into a small pine wood coffin and laid to rest. It may seem kind of creepy to many of us today, imagining being crunched up in this position in death, but again, it is great for storage. You don't usually think of gladiator bones being found anywhere outside of Rome, but in 2010 an entire gladiator grave was unearthed in Britain. Excavations led by the York Archaeological Trust in 2010 uncovered 80 skeletons dating back to the 1st to 4th centuries CE. Most of these remains were male, robust, and taller than average. Most disturbingly, a lot of the men had their heads separated from their bodies, either having them placed in their hands or between their knees. Pretty gruesome, but it appeared as if they'd been buried with respect. Forensic analysis revealed bite marks on one skeleton, which had probably been made by a lion, tiger, or bear, another clue they'd been gladiators fighting in an arena with wild animals. A lot of the skeletons also had one arm significantly stronger than the other, a sign of intense weapons training from a very young age. The findings came from the Driftfield Terrace site, where excavation had began in 2004. Dr. Michael Wysocki from the University of Central Lancashire stated, "These are internationally important discoveries. We don't have any other potential gladiator cemeteries with this level of preservation anywhere else in the world." Look at this poor fella. In 2014, archaeologists in Bulgaria found these remains at a 13th century Thracian site, the remains of a man who had been staked as a vampire. The skeleton belonged to a man who was likely in his 40s at the time, and an iron rod had been driven through his chest to prevent him from rising from the dead. His left leg had also been removed and placed beside his body, just to make sure he wouldn't be able to walk around if he did manage to de-stake himself. During the period these bones were dated, many Eastern European cultures believed that vampires were a very real danger, particularly when it was someone who died under what was deemed an unusual circumstance. So to protect the living, communities would stake bodies to make sure they wouldn't come back. This isn't the only corpse found to have been a so-called vampire burial. Far from it. Remains have been found across Bulgaria and other parts of Europe. At a site in Poland, archaeologists found remains of people buried with a sickle placed over their throat so that they rose from the dead, they'd lob off their own heads as they sat up. And there's something very cartoony, very Looney Tunesy about that method, in a definitely more grim, macabre sort of way. In 2012, in the small village of Bergheim, France, archaeologists found an ancient pit filled with human bones, specifically arms, hands, and fingers. This pit, known as Pit 157, is about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep, and it dates back nearly 6,000 years. The excavation began when an archaeological company was conducting surveys ahead of construction work in the area. While exploring a 5-acre site filled with ancient storage pits called silos, they discovered a total of 60 silos, 14 of which contained human bones. Pit 157 stood out because it was nearly filled with human remains, unlike the others, which were mostly empty or had different types of artifacts. The bones found in the pit included at least 7 upper limbs from different people. Shortly after these limbs were discarded, the bodies of 7 other individuals were also thrown into the pit. As for exactly what happened here, that's a mystery. Who killed these people? Why were their arms removed? Unfortunately, the answers to those questions have been lost to time. Not only was the Krakatoa volcano eruption of 1883 incredibly deadly, it also produced the loudest sound ever heard by human ears. People 3,000 miles away described it sounding like cannon fire. Here's a piece of audio recording of what it likely would have sounded like, not that we can mimic the actual intensity. The eruption began on May 20th and continued until October 21st. The most catastrophic moment, though, came on August 27th, when over 70% of the island and surrounding areas were obliterated. The eruption claimed at least 36,417 lives, mostly due to the tsunamis that it triggered. The explosive force was so great that it caused waves up to 120 feet high, devastating coastal towns and changing some landscapes permanently. The consequences extended far beyond Indonesia. The ash cloud affected weather patterns worldwide. The creepiest part, though, are the stories that surfaced in the months and years following this eruption. Large fields of pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock, floated across the Indian Ocean, and many of these pumice rafts carried human skeletons. One story goes that in July of 1884, students at a mission school in Zanzibar playing at the beach discovered black volcanic stones washing ashore. As they went to get a closer look, they were horrified to find human bones mixed in among the stones. Turned out skeletons had been washing up along the southeastern coast of Africa for almost a year after the eruption. In 2016, archaeologists excavating an ancient Greek cemetery discovered the remains of at least 80 skeletons found in a mass grave. These skeletons date back to between the 8th and 5th century BCE and were shackled by iron cuffs around their wrists It looked like they'd been victims of a mass execution. The site is part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis, an ancient burial ground that was uncovered during construction for a new National Opera House and library in downtown Athens. The head of the excavation stated at the time that they were, quote, executed, all in the same manner, but that they were buried with respect. So the question is, who were these folks? Why were they taken out, and why were they buried with such care? Most of the skeletons belonged to very young people who appeared to be in good health at the time of their deaths as well. Is this a death metal album cover, or is this an actual archaeological find? Well, you clicked the video, you know the answer. Yes, this is a real wall of human skulls constructed by the ancient Aztecs. Archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History came across a tower filled with 119 human skulls while restoring a building on the site of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. This tower is believed to be one of the 7 that once stood in this ancient city, located near the ruins of the Templo Mayor, a religious center dedicated to the Aztec gods of war and rain. Researchers first thought the skulls belonged mainly to defeated male warriors, but more recent analysis revealed that some of these skulls belonged to women and youths as well. Archaeologist Barrera Rodriguez said that while some of the skulls may have belonged to warriors, others could have been from people used in sacrificial ceremonies. In Aztec culture, human sacrifices were viewed as necessary acts to sustain the gods and, by extension, protect the universe itself. Rukpind Lake in the Himalayas of India has a pretty ominous nickname. It's often referred to as Skeleton Lake, and that's because, for a brief period during the summer, the frozen surface of the lake melts, revealing hundreds of human skeletons lying at the bottom. The skeletons were first reported in the 19th century, but gained more attention when a game reserve ranger came across the remains again in 1942. At the time, the belief was that the skeletons belonged to Japanese soldiers, but it turned out the remains were much older. In 2004, it was discovered that these bones dated back to around 850 CE and belonged to 2 distinct groups of people. Most likely they were killed by a severe hailstorm, as analysis showed that a lot of them had suffered blunt force trauma to their upper bodies. Well, with all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.